Welcome to a special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I am joined by Nick Warren, a Juris Doctor student from the University of Sydney who has participated in the Menzies Early Career Network. This unique network has offered university students a fantastic opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, get to know like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in this program, the 2024 participants have contributed chapters to our new publication, Finding Menzies, a New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. So in this episode, I'm going to discuss with Nick his chapter, Menzies the Student, Menzies the Statesman. So welcome, Nick.
Hi, Georgina. How are you going?
I'm very well, thanks. Well, look, I was particularly charmed and enamoured with your chapter. I was a student of international law in my master's degree and undergraduate degree way back when. And so this is a really, really interesting topic. But why did you choose this topic, Nick? Tell me.
Well, I'm a current law student myself, so I was attracted to Menzies' career prior to him joining politics, which was as a very successful barrister. But upon doing a little bit more research on Menzies, I found out that his career had been succinctly covered by Justice Edelman. So I had to make sure I didn't cover ground already trodden upon, and I found that Menzies had written the essay, The Rule of Law During the War. And I sort of decided to take that essay and compare it to his memoirs, Afternoon Light. And I found it a very interesting natural experiment, one which you probably don't get amongst too many world leaders like Menzies, where you have somebody who has a couple of ideas, let's say, on international law and order, and then they get to bookend their career with their own memoirs. So it serves as a really interesting natural experiment on how his thesis played out, whether he adhered to it or changed his mind over the course of his career.
And what was the answer you came to?
Like all good lawyers, he bent his original thesis to fit the narrative at the time.
So the essay Rule of Law During War, which he won the Bowen Prize for, and of course is written during World War One. So for a student at university like Menzies, seeing many people he knew go off to the battlefields in Europe and many not come home actually. Two of his brothers go. So he was personally very, very deeply affected. Thankfully, they both came home well. But this essay is really interesting. Do you want to explain what it was about?
So Menzies divides his essay into three chapters, namely covering what the rule of law is, which is a Darcian concept from uh, medieval to late medieval English history, as I believe, saying the rule of law must stand above the rule of individuals. I think each and every man is accountable to the law equally. But then we sort of get to where the rule of law must be sort of manipulated in times of national crisis. And so he sort of sets the scene with how the British Parliament during World War One is adhering to the rule of law as best it can without sacrificing national security. Then moves through into the Australian legislature's response during that period as well. And then summarizing in the final chapter, which is how international law and order is adapting to the first really international conflict of its time. And yeah, so he sort of covers those three topics in turn.
And what's his basic argument then in the essay? What's he sort of pushing for? Is he happy with how the Australian government is handling rule of law in Australia during that time of national crisis and international crisis?
Menzies is a renowned Anglophile, so he's all for the rule of law as the English see it, and he's also a massive proponent of conscription. So he finds absolutely nothing wrong with how the British or the Australian governments were conducting their campaigns. But his basic thesis of the essay is sort of summed up at the very, very end, in which he says the common international law can only be affected if the common man on the street holds his government accountable, which is an interesting sort of position, but very hard to sort of work with. It's a bit of an aphorism. I sort of decided to work with some of the more tangible points he makes, including that international arbitration is key to avoiding future conflict, and superior international bodies like the League of Nations that would come after World War One, or United Nations after World War Two, are key to sort of enforcing these arbitration decisions.
So Menzies obviously is quite involved in the sort of periphery, I guess, and with the establishment of the United Nations. And of course, his political opponent in Doc Evatt goes over to negotiate the treaty and the charter, and then becomes president of the General Assembly. So it has a really, really key role in the founding of the United Nations. Do you think that Menzies was happy with how the United Nations ended up after all the efforts and obviously the lessons learned with the failure of the League of Nations?
Well, in his original essay, he definitely calls for something like the United Nations to sort of fix what he views as the catalyst to international conflicts. But we see in memoirs such as Afternoon Light that he time and time again runs up against the United Nations, sort of views them as an obstacle to international security as a whole, particularly when you have veto blocks to the communist nations. So in instances like the Suez Canal crisis, he really struggles to sort of work with the United Nations as he views them as a massive obstacle to them.
Yeah, and I guess there's that issue around national sovereignty and and then the sort of international governments and international bodies having the power to interfere in national sovereignty and broker peace, or force countries to do things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do. I mean, how do you see Menzies grappling with those tensions?
Uh, Probably the most interesting example is the Korean War, where the United Nations was able to work with Western forces, let's say, in sort of intervening in the Korean conflict. And that was only because the Soviet bloc decided not to participate in the uh, in the United Nations during that time. And that's something that I actually learned through writing this process. Zach from the Menzies Institute was very helpful in sort of guiding me through some of these finer points of international history like that.
What about this proposition that the rule of law could be compromised in wartime, and that it sort of led to his attempts then to ban the Communist Party? Because I mean, this becomes one of the more controversial legacies of the Menzies era. I mean, he fails to ban the Communist Party, of course, but he's held up as a liberal. He professes to be a liberal, and yet wants to ban a political party that opposes him.
Yeah, and that's really the crux of the two pieces, therefore definitely my piece. If we look at his Bowen Prize essay, he really talks about how the arbitrary detention of individuals during World War One should be limited to only that particular conflict, as he views the transgression against the rule of law. So we definitely see that Menzies is okay with shrinking the rule of law in the time of a national crisis. So when we fast forward to the 50s, when the Australian government was trying to ban communists and sort of actively stop them from participating in politics, we can sort of understand that Menzies definitely viewed these particular individuals, definitely viewed the communist organization as a whole as a threat to national security. Once you expand that outside of Australia's borders, you realize that the latter half of the 20th century was essentially driven by a lot of communist conflicts. You can definitely start to understand his position to ban communist influence within Australia. But as history tells us, he was unsuccessful in banning them outright. But he definitely raised the alarm at that prospect.
There's a sense that he saw the Communist Party as promoting subversion of the rule of law, and so it was sort of then consistent with his approach to upholding the rule of law to attempt to ban a party that opposed the rule of law. Is that how you conceive of it?
Yeah, exactly right. If you read some of his letters to Doc Evatt or his parliamentary replies, we can definitely see that he views the communists as subverting the United Nations as a whole, which sort of feeds into our earlier discussion that he thinks the United Nations is sort of constrained by that Soviet voting bloc. Yeah, in particular, he sort of views the communists in Australia as a subversion against the rule of law.
Do you think the Australian people got it right in 1951, voting down his referendum to ban the Communist Party, or do you think they might have? I mean, it was very close. It was basically a sort of 50-50 proposition. It was not many votes in it. Nothing like, say, the referendum we had last year, where it was definitive. This really could have gone the other way.
Yeah, it's definitely a very close referendum indeed. As to whether the Australian people got it right, I think I'll defer to history and say that we're still here. So I think we should be thankful that did happen. Whilst communism may present a threat to Western values as a whole, and I definitely agree with Menzies that communism does seek to subvert the rule of law uh, in its original form. I think we must still stick to our Western values of the rule of law and allowing for dissent of thought. And even though communism may be inconsistent with some of those Western values, we must still allow those voices to be heard. We can't just shut down anything arbitrarily on those grounds.
It's interesting when you look at sort of questions of freedom of speech, just more broadly in today's atmosphere, where there's some really awful actions being taken against certain members of the community, and you wonder where does where is the line crossed in order to keep our social cohesion. What do you think Menzies would think of what's happening today in university campuses? And obviously here in Melbourne, we've had some pretty horrific acts recently against the Jewish community.
Menzies was definitely a proponent of robust and vigorous debate on campus. And we can see through some of the sources that he was readily involved in student politics at the University of Melbourne, particularly on the debate of conscription. But I think he really was stopped short at some of the more violent acts of protest we've seen. I think those do not have a place in our society either. And I think whilst we can debate things that go on outside of our border, I'd say Menzies would hope that the dissent stops at debate.
The question of conscription, while it's not particularly a live issue today, I mean, given the geopolitical climate at the moment, we've got Russia invading Ukraine, we've got war and real crisis in the Middle East. Syria has just fallen yet again, and of course Israel under sustained attack from several borders. And then the saber rattling in China, there is a sort of a sense that the world is on a precipice. If the worst did happen and Australia sort of entered a World War III, what does your generation, Nick, Gen Z, how do you think your generation would grapple with a conscription debate?
You're asking the big questions, Georgina. I'm not sure if I'm the representative of my generation as a whole, but I would say it is a sentiment that if our national security and our way of life is threatened, we'd see a massive uptake in the will to defend that. But I will say that there is less enthusiasm to rush into pointless wars and sort of arbitrary conflicts that really don't affect us too much over here in Australia.
Yeah, well, that's always a test, isn't it? Where do your interests stop? Are they at your territorial border, or do you conceive of your interests, your national interests, beyond your territorial border because of the flow-on effects? And Menzies took a broad view of it, of course, through the Cold War, and committed troops to Korea, to the Malay emergency, of course, confrontasi with Indonesia, and then of course finally the Vietnam War. None of those wars were on Australia's shores, but
In our
Australia's
back door,
interests.
in our
Yeah,
backyard rather.
that's right. That's right. Well, Nick, thank you so much for writing this chapter, and I think a really interesting exercise in comparing Menzies of 20 years old to Menzies of 75 years old, and how he evolved in terms of his thinking about the rule of law in a time of war and crisis. And does one stay consistent through life? I guess that's a big question. And does it matter if one doesn't have the same views as one did 55 years ago? I mean, I'm sure I've changed my mind on a few things, and I'm sure in your short time on Earth, you have too.
Of course, of course. No, thank you for having me, Georgina, and thank you for including me in this program. It's been fascinating to research not just Robert Menzies, but Australia's political history as a whole. I think after researching this project, I think uh, Australian history is not taught nearly enough to this generation. So you're definitely doing the right work, encouraging this sort of learning.
Thanks so much, Nick. Been great to have you involved.
No worries, Georgina. Thank you.